1, 2. All right, Foster, we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. It's so much fun to do these interviews because each time I appear, the number of my books goes up thanks to you. So magically, mushroom. But we're here tonight to talk about a really interesting book, Secrets of a Life on Stage and Off, by our guest, Ed Dixon, who's had a long career in musical theater and straight theater as well. And I have to say right off at the top, Ed, having read your book, I trust you because you're very honest. What I don't trust in reading a theatrical memoir is something to the effect, everybody was wonderful. Everybody was just terrific. That's not life. It certainly isn't life in the theater.
Richard Rogers wrote one like that.
Yeah.
Not the people who wrote about him, but his book.
And you know it can't possibly be truthful. But when somebody didn't behave well, you let us know. And so when you say somebody was really decent, I believe you, because you're willing to call out somebody who behaved poorly. Now, to start on that note, you were very lucky at the beginning of your career. Your first Broadway credit really is No No Nanette.
Yeah,
I saw it. It was an extraordinary hit with Ruby Keeler and Patsy Kelly and Helen Gallagher. It was just a huge hit.
Yes, it was.
But there was some terrible behavior backstage.
Oh my God, was there ever? Some of the worst behavior I've ever seen from the management. And here it was, this show that was just lighter than air and sweetness and life, old-fashioned goodness and sincerity, and behind the scenes,
How do you account for that? Can you, after all these years?
No, it was an amazing way to be introduced to the milieu, like, oh my God, it's a snake pit. Oh my God, it's dangerous. I mean, people were being fired. They fired a dozen people on the first day. Over the first 3 or 4 weeks, they fired like 30 people. At one point, I was going to the airport as we were going from one city to another in the out-of-town tryouts, and they tapped the guy next to me on the shoulder and said, "You can get out of line. You won't be going to the next city." It was so mean-spirited. I had a little thing on my mirror at the Richard Rogers Theater that said KYMS, and people would ask me what it meant, and I wouldn't tell them, but it meant keep your mouth shut. It was dangerous there.
But a woman who shall live in infamy, I will never forget her, May Muth.
May Muth. That thing that she did with me was one of the cruelest things that I've ever seen. She tried to hold me to a chorus contract when I was being offered a leading role in Leonard Bernstein's Mass to open the Kennedy Center. She tried to hold me to my chorus contract, and the union took my side, and otherwise I wouldn't have been in Bernstein's Mass and I wouldn't have opened the Kennedy Center.
But she probably didn't want you to have that credit.
She didn't, and she gave me my notice back. I had turned my notice in. I was so thrilled because the place was a snake pit, and I was just about to walk on stage to back up Helen Gallagher. She shoved my notice back in my hand and said, "I'm not accepting your notice." And I had to walk out on stage and stand behind Helen Gallagher and sing, "Where has my hubby gone blues?" And I cried through the whole number.
But tell us though, there's some wonderful heartwarming stories connected with this production.
Yeah.
The opening matinee, was it in Boston? With Ruby
Keeler,
oh
my God.
At the top of the stairs, Ruby Keeler making her entrance. You had not performed before an audience before.
For 30 years.
Happened.
She played golf. She made cookies. She was a sweet mom. She was scared out of her mind. She didn't think anybody remembered her. She and Patsy were old friends from the movie, and they would just stand in the corner kibitzing with each other. They were so frightened. And it comes time for Ruby's big entrance, and she appears at the top of a grand staircase, and the audience goes nuts, just screaming. And she starts down the stairs, and she pauses at the landing to wait for them to stop applauding. They won't stop applauding. So she starts to cry and has to turn up stage. Helen Gallagher is waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs. Helen, who is a tough cookie, starts to cry, and she has to turn up stage. I mean, it was so sad. And you know, when Helen talked about Ruby years later, she said working with Ruby was the nicest experience of her career. She was a wonderful woman, and as wonderful as Ruby was, her sister Gertrude, who was also in all those old movies, they practically looked just alike. She was my absolute favorite. Every night before Ruby went on to do the big tap number, she would get down on her hands and knees and strap Ruby's tap shoes on her and straighten her hose. And I would watch this wonderful woman do this every day. And finally I said, Gertrude, why are you doing this for your sister? And she said, during the Depression, Ruby kept all of us alive.
She was paying back. Yeah, she was paying back. But during rehearsals, you were not at all sure that the play was going to go over. In fact, you sort of were prepared that this was going to be a big flop.
I mean, you have to know, Pippin was a huge hit right now. Jesus Christ Superstar was just about to open, and nobody had ever revived an old musical from the 1920s. So when we were in a rehearsal room singing Tea for Two, I mean, we thought it was the dumbest thing ever. We had no idea people were going to flip out for the nostalgia of it.
The timing was perfect. It was just the right time. And it was, I told you, I saw it. It was a beautiful production.
Yes, the orchestration, the sets, the costumes. Raoul Pendubois did both. It was such a jewel box to look at, and and the way it sounded, the orchestra was out of this world, and the orchestrations, and it drove people nuts. Nobody had done an old revival before.
But working on the show were names that I'm sure many of our listeners will recognize. Busby Berkeley was at first the choreographer for the show. He hadn't worked in a long time.
He was the director originally.
And were there problems with him at that time?
He was in his 80s, and he was 80s the way the 80s was in 1970. He was a very old man, and he liked a cocktail, and he always had a cigar in his mouth, and he really didn't seem functional. And they brought in Bert Shevelov, who had rewritten the book, and I didn't understand how brilliant his rewrite was at the time, but he was also a brilliant staging person, and he really took over and did everything. The big ideas really were Busby's, the girls dancing on the beach balls, and a number of the major set pieces of the piece were really Busby's ideas. So he wasn't just a figurehead.
But could you tell from that he had been a great choreographer?
No.
You couldn't tell.
He hardly could get out of a chair. I mean, he was old. And I was so young, I'm like 20. So both he and Irving Caesar, I don't think I ever had a conversation with Busby. I had a conversation with Irving, but Irving always had a cigar close his mouth, and all he wanted to do was tell stories about the theater. And I would run away from him. He stunk of cigar smoke. And when it was all over, years later, I thought, my God, he worked on Tin Pan Alley. He knew Irving Berlin. He knew Cole Porter. I could have asked him anything. I asked him nothing because,
I knew him at the end of his life, and he was so eager to talk about the past. And if you had a sense of history, he was a treasure trove.
Yes.
Irving Caesar was a masterful storyteller. Shame on you, Ed Dixon, but you did come to realize you'd made a mistake.
A lot of people, when they're 20, sometimes I've done a show where I'm sitting down for like 3 months at a time with a bunch of young people, and I come away and I go, not one of them asked me a question.
Well, you know what it feels like.
I do, yes.
But then after making this auspicious debut in a landmark show, as you said already, you opened the Kennedy Center as part of the ensemble in Leonard Bernstein's Mass, and you worked with Mr. Bernstein directly.
There were 12 soloists. I mean, imagine being picked by Leonard Bernstein to be a soloist in a work that is opening the John F. Kennedy Center. And Alvin Ailey was doing the choreography. Yeah, it was so overwhelming. It was so enormous. There was an onstage marching band. There was a symphony orchestra. There was a calypso band. There was a jazz band. There was a children's chorus. There was the entire Norman Scribner choir, the entire Alvin Ailey dance company, Judith Jemison leading the pack. It was, and here I was, I hadn't thought that the art of No No Nanette was worth the way people carried on about it. And here I am doing real art with a real artist. And the critics come in and say, this is crap. Get this the hell out of here. And those were my first two theatrical experiences. You can't tell what is going to happen to your show.
What was Mr. Bernstein like to work with?
He was so brilliant that when you were with him, you couldn't. It was so surreal to be. He had his own TV show. He was doing those concerts with teaching music to children. He was the conductor of the Philharmonic. He was the composer of West Side Story. He was so famous that at one point I was in a studio rehearsal room with him, just the two of us. He's playing the piano, I'm singing. It was so overwhelming. At one point I was left alone in the wings with him. I'm like, what could I possibly say to Leonard Bernstein in the wings?
But he wasn't, as you describe him, he wasn't at all unapproachable.
But you have to have a lot of gumption to walk into a thing like that. I mean, he was lovely to me. He said wonderful things to me, and he gave me this wonderful break. He was never even remotely unpleasant to me or intimidating, but his presence was so intimidating. I mean, I met Birgit Nielsen once in Graz, Austria, and she's my favorite person in the world, but I thought I would die before I finished the conversation. How can a human being talk to somebody who is that exalted?
But as you described the encounter with her in your book, she was very grounded and down to earth.
Completely. She was so grounded that I dissolved like instant coffee in front of her.
Now, what's interesting, Ed, and I didn't know this because I associate you with musical theater, but you had an operatic voice and you did some opera.
I did a lot. I worked for 7 or 8 different opera companies, and it climaxed with me going to Austria. I was on an audition tour of all of Germany and Austria, going to one opera house after another, auditioning. And I got this job in Graz, and I met Birgit, and I got to make my debut. And it had just become clear by me running away and joining the circus of going away to be in the opera in Europe, that it wasn't the right road. Like, I really put the coat on and I went, this coat doesn't fit. And it was when I left Graz and came back to New York, that's when my musical theater career really began in earnest.
And you were in a number of musicals that perhaps posterity doesn't have good words about, but I have a soft spot for shows like Three Musketeers,
Oh,
Scarlet Pimpernell, Cyrano, about which you say some unflattering things. I remember loving the score, and this wonderful Anne Ranulfson,
oh, she's
extraordinary
brilliant,
voice.
brilliant.
Brilliant.
We were in
But
Les Mis together. Yeah.
I loved these shows. I know they're not well thought of. I even liked an operetta that nobody dares to say they liked. I liked it, Tale of Two Cities. I enjoyed it very much. So I liked all of them.
Yeah.
But you were in them, but you don't seem to have kind things to say about Scarlet Pimpernel. You were shocked that it ran for years.
Doug Sills was so great. When I saw that it was coming in, I thought they need a big star, and there was some big star being bandied around. I can't even remember. And at the first day of rehearsal, when Doug Sills walked in, I thought they could have had a star, and they got this guy that no one's ever heard of. And then I saw him work, and I'm like, oh my God, he saved every moment that he had in the show. He saved every number. He saved every piece of choreography. And he not only saved it, he made it vivid and living and vibrant, and people went nuts for him. The construction was awful. The book was awful, unspeakably awful. And the direction was awful.
But he was great.
And the audiences loved him, and rightfully so.
I remember loving the show. I liked the book. And I loved the score of Cyrano. Is it no good?
Here was my big song. You take some flour, da 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 da, and add some eggs, da 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 da, and then you stir, da 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 da. That I went on like that for like 7 pages. And I tried pulling things out of my hat. I whirled things in the air. I spun around. I threw pies. It was the Baker song, anything to enliven it. But what it was at base was da 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 da. None of the big hooks worked it, but the scenery was out of this world. Joop van den Ende, the producer, had endless money, and he made these glorious sets and glorious lighting and glorious orchestrations. And Sheldon Harnick came in and tried to repair the lyrics, because although the Dutch lyricists did speak English, they don't speak English the way Sheldon Harnick speaks English.
You were then in one of these grandiose, I guess you call it grandiose operatic musicals that, again, I love. A friend of mine says it's the worst show he's ever seen. I couldn't disagree more. Les Mis.
Ah, yes.
I love Les Mis. I think it has a great score. I love the storytelling. I love the construction of it.
Yes, I think that's great too. I think anybody who's done it 1,700 times, which I have, could tell you there's lots of places that could be excised and no one would be the wiser.
Okay.
If it got down to 2 hours, I think you'd really have something. Like
I remember seeing it at a matinee at the Palace Theatre in London. And I was so absorbed in it. I remember saying to myself, I hope this show just goes on and on and on and on. I didn't want it to end.
Wow.
I guess it didn't.
I don't think the original version was like 3 hours and 15 or 20 minutes. Doing that 8 times a week, holy crap, that was really
Was that your longest run?
Yes. Yes. I mean, the longest I'd ever done anything at that point was a year. And I passed a year, and then I passed 2 years, and then I passed 3 years, and then I hit 4 years. And, the human mind is not meant to repeat a show that many times. That's not how the human mind is designed. It's a great show, and I met great people in it, and I saw great performances, and that is a real super hit.
Yeah, but I think it's fabulous. Now, tell me if this is off base and you don't want to talk about it, but in your book, you do talk about what was happening with you off stage at a certain point in Les Mis. It's very painful and difficult reading. We're having a light evening. You may not want to go into it, but
I mean, I talk about it a lot. I, like so many people, took a wrong turn in the 1980s and ended up dealing with some drugs that I couldn't handle. And it was 3 years, but it's very amusing when I look back on it. It's not like I lost 3 years. I worked the entire time. My life was devastated. And I certainly never dreamed that I would write about it. But after I got my life together, and my life was so much better than it had ever been before, I thought, I have to write this. People have to know that you can drive the car completely off the road, and it is possible to not only get back on the road, but to have a better trip than you could have ever imagined.
What do you attribute your comeback to? I mean, you were in very bad shape for a while.
Yes. It was interesting. Once I showed signs to people that I was really on the right road and getting myself together, people wanted to help, and people did help. And somebody said to me, wouldn't it be funny if it was your drug addiction that put your career over the top? And I said, well, that's exactly what happened. And also, I'm lucky. Like, the final ingredient in everything in the theater is always luck. You can be as grandiose as you like, you can work as hard as you like, you can be as talented as you like, but if fate doesn't tap you on the head at the end of the day, nothing will happen. And I'm just ridiculously lucky.
So when you overcame your addiction, your career took off, and you had a number of prominent roles on Broadway, touring editions.
And I got to do some plays. I got to do some play. To the chances of a musical theater actor doing plays on Broadway is about the same chances I have of winning Miss America. I mean, that doesn't happen. And it did happen. And I'll always be grateful for that and for the people who made that happen.
You had 3 really interesting credits in straight theater: The Persians,
yes,
Gore Vidal's Best Man, and The Iceman Cometh.
Yes.
I'm interested in The Persians because one of the people you don't portray with great fondness is Tony Randall.
He behaved very poorly, and I was a huge fan. I saw him do a night of Neil Simon when I didn't know that he was a great stage actor, and he absolutely blew my socks off. I was prepared to just tell him how much I admired him, but that's not the way it went.
He behaved poorly.
He behaved poorly. But I do have to say, you're probably never going to talk with someone who's done 2 productions of The Persian, the oldest play in recorded history. I've done it twice, 2 different versions in 2 different theaters.
No, but nobody else can make that claim, I'm sure.
Well, I've also done Philemon, that unknown. Come on, they wrote the Fantastics. Harvey Schmidt
and Jones.
their piece, I've done that twice.
But you were in a very highly regarded production of The Iceman Cometh.
Yes, I was. And that was a truly extraordinary experience. I mean, the actors in that production were, I mean, they've all become ridiculously famous since then. Some of them were just starting to become famous at that time. Paul Giamatti, for instance, who was so lovely, and he's become so gigantic. He'd only done one movie at that point.
Now, Kevin Spacey was the star of the show.
Yes, he was.
And I saw the production. He was fantastic in it.
Yes.
Is he getting a fair deal these days, or do we want to mention that at all?
Well, it's not for me to say. I mean, I do, as a person who has behaved incorrectly, I can tell you that he was behaving incorrectly. And he was called on the carpet. And I don't want to see somebody be wiped out. A lot of people have behaved incorrectly. To be erased altogether, that is a very peculiar thing, especially if you're an artist. I tell you, the thing that really struck me about him was he was so into spontaneity. He was capable of holding the entire show, which was what, 3.5 hours long, 4 hours long.
Was it that long?
In free form. Nothing was attached to a particular location or a particular prop or a particular actor or a particular part of the stage. Like Monday, he might be standing next to me, talking to me. Tuesday, he'd be on the other side of the stage talking to somebody else. And in his big monologue, it bore no resemblance to itself from one performance to the next. That is not what I believe. He's much more famous than I am. I believe that there are rights and wrongs and that lines mean something. And after you've done them a few times, it starts to become clear what the intention, what the meaning, and who you would be saying it to. And that was not true for him.
Was it unnerving to act with him?
Yes. But one night I thought the big 20-minute monologue landed like a ton of bricks. And I thought, oh, he's really found it now. This is what, and he never did that again.
And you work in a different way. It gets set.
It's not that it's set. It's that if this line can't either be funny or angry at this point in the middle of the monologue, but like after this happens and this happens and this happens, this line here is either funny or angry, but I don't think you get to do that, to make that radical a decision, except he's an extremely famous actor, and in movies they want absolute spontaneity. I didn't find it successful on stage.
Now, you did get to meet Gore Vidal when you were doing Gore Vidal, Best Man. What are your impressions of him?
I mean, he lived up to the whole potato. I mean, he's so brilliant. He gave me his book, The Golden Age, and I looked at it, and it's 1,000,000 pages long, and I thought, I'll never get through this. One day I opened it up, and I didn't stop till I got to the end of it. I mean, a fantastic writer, a fantastic raconteur. He's a fantastic impressionist. He could do anybody, from any one of the Kennedys to any famous political person to any famous Hollywood person. Just a brilliant, brilliant man.
And not standoffish. He engaged with the cast.
Oh, just like he did drink himself into oblivion at the end of every day, which made me say, I just have to tell you something. While we were working together, I turned on the TV on some weird off the charts channel, and he was giving a talk at a college, and somebody asked him about Oh, who's the guy he had the famous fight with publicly?
Truman Capote?
No, super right wing.
Oh, William Buckley.
William Buckley. So somebody asked him about William F. There's like 2,000 kids in the audience. And he said, well, I'll tell you one thing. William F. Buckley is not as nice as he looks. And the laugh lasted about 10 minutes.
And that was a successful production, The Best Man.
Yes, it was, with wonderful, wonderful. I got to know Charles Durning, to sit around one-on-one with Charles Durning, with him telling me stories about the war and heroism in war, and how he loved to sing, and how he loved to dance, and how his career had not gone the way he thought it was. Like, he thought he would be famous really early on, and it took him a long time to make his mark. I mean, just a marvelous, marvelous man. And I became lifelong friends with Christine Ebersol during that. I mean, the minute we met, it was just like I'd been waiting to meet her forever.
One of the most heartwarming sections of the book is your long tour, national tour, in Best Little Whorehouse in Texas with Anne Margaret.
Oh my
and you
God.
present her as amazingly nice, beginning, middle, and end. She never got off that. That's who she is. She's a nice, decent lady.
We were doing a 1.5-year long tour, and a lot of the cities were just 1 week. And she was one of the most famous women in the world. And I thought, when she goes, she'd never done a musical before. She'd done her act in Vegas. She'd never done a book musical before. I thought, she's going to see how hard this is, doing this 8 times a week. She's going to last 2 weeks and she'll be out the door. The only show she ever missed in 1.5 years was when her mother died. And she and her mother were like completely joined at the hip. And that story of her going and me watching her come back just completely shattered, and entering the theater in a big black picture hat with a veil, like a scene from a movie. She could hardly walk with grief. And when I heard her voice start the show, I thought, good God, she'll never make it to the end. And she makes it to the end, but they'd added a song for her at the end called You Were a Friend to Me. And she has to stand out there and sing You Were a Friend. And she makes it all the way through till she gets to the very last, You were a friend to, and then she just completely lost it. And so did I. In the curtain call, it was a staged curtain call. She was supposed to come up to me and shove me and say, you shut me down, because the governor had shut. She came up to me in the curtain call, grabs my lapel and kisses me right on the lips and said, oh, I ain't mad at you. My God.
Was she good in the show?
She was really good in the singing. In the book scenes, she played them as if she was in a movie, and she would disappear into her partner on stage, into her scene partner, and it didn't go out into the house. The idea of making a performance go out into the house was foreign to her.
And it didn't change on the course of the tour?
No.
But on the other hand,
the director tried to make her be more gritty in places, and she just wouldn't do it. That's not who she is. It's not how she wanted to play it, and she wouldn't do it.
Did audiences love her nonetheless?
Yes. She's Aunt Margaret, and she was
Aunt Margaret. How could you not?
She was wearing Bob Mackie, you know.
How could you not? But I when you said throughout that she was unfailingly gracious and polite to everybody.
Everyone, to the crew. I once watched her. There were 2 lesbian fans who had everything of hers, all memorabilia and photos and books. she stood there and signed every piece of memorabilia, and then they wanted a photo, and then they wanted another photo, and then they wanted, and it just, I watched it just going on, and she just, I think this is a perfect Anne Margaret. We did our first night at some gigantic arena in Connecticut, like an ice hockey arena. And she'd never done an onstage musical before. And it gets to the end of it and they want to take publicity photos. So she's just finished doing, for an enormous crowd, her very first musical comedy on stage. And they're taking her picture of her plastered up against the proscenium, picture after picture after picture. And finally she says, are we done? And the guy goes, oh, just one more. And she went, oh, and that's it. That was a temper tantrum from Miss Anne Margaret.
That's as much of a temper tantrum as she could come up with.
Oh.
She sounds so endearing.
Just
so
absolutely delightful. She had a little dog named Missy that went with her everywhere. When we moved into a new theater, instead of having a sign that said Anne Margaret's dressing room, it would say Missy's dressing room.
Now, you did tour in Pippin for a while.
Yes,
and your star, Ben Vereen, perhaps the word endearing might not apply with the same impact there.
You know, Ben is a wonderful man and a wonderful performer, and a world famous man. I don't think he was that interested in doing Pippin again, but they were paying him an absolute fortune. And he was supposedly directing it as well, but he wasn't really directing it. And I think he was making $54,000 a week, when $54,000 a week was, at that point, and this would have been like 85, that was $1 billion. And they hired an unknown person to play Pippin, and I saw his paycheck one day. It was $1,500. And I just thought, that's not right. But that's also show business. So.
Was Ben Vereen a good teammate? Was he a team player?
We did have some good laughs together. I don't think I'd be speaking out of turn if I said he liked ladies.
We can fill in the blanks there.
Yes, he really liked ladies.
You have a wonderful story. Look, any musical theater person has to go to Mount Everest. So you dealt with Mount Everest. You were in a Stephen Sondheim show.
Oh.
And you got to know him. You were in a revival of Sunday in the Park with George.
The first revival ever of Sunday in the Park with George.
First revival.
Yes. And at one point, early in rehearsal, he invited the entire cast to his home in Turtle Bay. And you've never seen a group of fully grown adult actors turn into infants than when they find out they're going to Stephen Sondheim. I was standing in front of the door, afraid to ring the bell. This is like that Leonard Bernstein story from earlier. It's like you have to have great possession of yourself to storm up to Stephen Sondheim and engage him in conversation. I didn't think I would ever engage him in conversation. And we're standing in front of the door, and this very well-known actor is saying, "You ring the bell." Somebody, "No, you ring the bell." "No, you ring the bell." Finally, somebody rings the bell and Sondheim opens the door himself, and we're all like, and then this remarkable thing happened. We start walking through his living room, and he's playing with his hair like an autistic child, twisting his hair and just not being really with us. And I'm like, okay, I'm never going to have a conversation with him. And we pass a big poster on the right-hand side of him that has Bert Shevelov's name on it, the guy who had directed No, No, Nanette. And he says, "Oh, I miss Bert." And I said, "You know, I knew him." And Sondheim goes, "Really?" And we got into a conversation that segued. He said, "Did Bert behave properly with you when you were 20?" And I said, "Well, at the opening night party in Boston, he kissed me on the staircase." And Sondheim goes, "Where's your staircase?" And then it segued into talking about Leonard Bernstein. He said, "You know, his piano is upstairs. He gave it to me. He signed it. I don't remember where, but somewhere on the keyboard, he signed it."
So he was not unapproachable at all.
No. I watched some people get quite sloshed with him on wine on the sofa, and he was enormously approachable. And just to have gotten to have those kind of interactions with someone of that magnitude. I sat at his piano with his pencils there and his writing paper, the piano where he wrote Sweeney Todd. Being in that house was just one of the most overwhelming things. And I have photos of everything. I took photos of everything.
Remind me, was that production short-lived? It didn't last as long as they had hoped?
It was a limited run, and it finished its complete limited run. They had some stars from London, and they had an expiration date, and there's something else was supposed to come into that theater. So we did the complete, and it was a great success. That young director who used animation the way he did, the animation was so, and they made the chromaloom work in the second act, which it did not originally. That was a brilliant piece of work. And also in our version, the second act was better than the first. And in the original production, everybody said the second act is for nothing. You know, it's all the first act. But in our version, particularly because of the leading lady, when she became the old lady in the second act, she was really an old lady. It transformed the entire piece. It was so moving.
Remind me, did Mr. Lapine direct the revival?
He did not.
He did not.
His name is Sam Buntrock. I knew I'd come up with it. I'm glad I did. A young director and who had started out in animation. So the animation part of it was really his doing.
Now, you had a wonderful part, Ed. It has to have been one of your greatest parts. You played Max von Meyerling for a year in Sunset Boulevard, which I think is a terrific show and a terrific score.
Yes. For my money, it's the only Andrew Lloyd Webber show that works 100% because the book is freaking great. The adapter took the book directly from the movie. It's almost word per word. The parts have such true depth. Max von Meyerling is as great a part as I could even imagine playing at that point in my life. The interesting thing about it was, in the movie, here's this character who's suffering all the time. He's suffering because the woman he loves doesn't love him, because he gave everything for her, because his own career is over, because her career, because they're living in a museum. But on the stage play, he's out there all the time. In the movie, they cut away from him. But when you're playing that part, I was out there suffering, looking at her kissing Joe, looking at her pulling Joe down on top of her, lurking in the shadows and watching the movies from behind with her, suffering. One day, we'd been doing it for about 6 months, and there was a moment where I have a hold of the curtain, and I'm at the doorway to the exit, and I'm watching her pull Joe down on top of her, and my job is to slowly let go of the curtain and pull back out of the light. And as I pulled back out of the light, I started to cry, and then I started to sob uncontrollably. And I realized I'd been in that state of suffering tension for 6 months. But I can't tell you how satisfying it is to be in a part that lets you go that deeply into, because in a musical, so often you just have to skim by the surface of an emotional situation. And then I got to do it with Eric Schaefer at the Signature Theater in an extremely intimate environment. And it's just that all of my memories of Sunset Boulevard are really special. And then I won the Helen Hayes Award, which just was the cherry on top. Yeah.
Now, your Norma Desmond was a name that many people will not be familiar with.
Flo Lacey, well, or Linda Balgord, the original.
Linda Balgord.
Linda Balgord was a favorite of Andrew Lloyd Webber's, and she'd worked with him a lot in London, and she'd worked with him a lot on Broadway. And he just loved the way she sang the score. And she had notes. She could hang up at belting a high D or even belting a high E. She could just do that all day. And so they put everything back in the original keys, and we went out on the road, and she was singing the living crap out of it. And so often the reviewers would say, why isn't there a big star? The world is so peculiar. She was so great, and she's such a dear friend. And getting to play like that final scene on the balcony when she's gone crazy, to share that with somebody who you really love, who's a really dear friend, it was such a great experience. And that set, that original Broadway set, when we were touring with the original, that house was on 2 lifts that would normally be on a cruiser in a military vessel to lift jet planes. 2 of them would lift that house and could move it around like a toy. And flying in on that, when the house would fly in toward the audience and land, or when you would fly up in the air on New Year's Eve with me pouring champagne, you can't imagine that a set would have that kind of impact on you, how you feel. It was just overwhelming.
I think the challenge for Norma Desmond in that show is, do you believe that she was a silent movie star? Mm-hmm. And that's a real challenge for a contemporary actress. Yes. Gloria Swanson is unbeatable in the film because she was the real thing.
Yes.
But Glenn Close, as good as she was in the part, I'm not convinced that her body language is not that of a silent movie star. I didn't see Linda. Did she evoke the era of silent movie?
And she was young, which also Gloria Swanson was young when she was washed up. She wasn't old, and she was young. And Linda was the same age as Gloria Swanson.
Gloria Swanson was 49 when she did the film, and people wrote about her as if she was 95. She was 49.
49 in Hollywood. Yeah.
She had been a star, but she was the real thing. It's very hard to evoke the body language and the gestures of a silent screen diva.
Yeah.
Really hard to do.
Yes.
Really hard to do. I want to ask you about the show you did recently and got a Drama Desk Award for, Your Adventures with Georgie, the George Rose story. He was a very good friend of yours, and then you did discover a secret life that he had. I haven't seen your show. Does the show reveal that?
Yes, the last half hour is truly terrifying. And I was so afraid when I wrote it. I thought, this will upset people so much they won't forgive me. But all anybody wanted to talk about was the last half hour. All the reviewers wanted to talk about was the last half hour. And finding a way to tell this awful story of someone who I idolized idolized, who had given some of the finest stage performances that I will ever see. I will never see a greater comic actor on a stage ever. And he was my friend. And I was able to watch him do this magic. And then he invited me to the Dominican Republic, and I found out he'd been living a double life all this time, and then he was beaten to death. It's an impossible story to tell. And in the final piece of writing, the writing took a long time. First of all, I sat on the story for 30 years before I even felt capable of telling it. And when I finally did, I found a way to bring it to its conclusion with some light. And I'm very proud of that.
Were you startled when you found out his attraction to young boys?
It was horrifying, because I was there in the Dominican Republic and I thought I was being invited to the Caribbean by Noel Coward. I mean, I just thought, I'm having this, nobody gets to have this. This is the greatest thing that could ever happen. And he picked me up at the airport with a 12-year-old in the back seat. So from the very beginning, everything was shattered. Because we'd been friends for 20 years at that point. Just absolutely devastating.
But then time went by and you were able to write the show, which I gather is ultimately a tribute to George.
Because what I learned was that, let's say you find out your father was a murderer. All of the experiences you had with your father previous to that information are frozen in amber. They exist exactly as they exist. So what are you supposed to do with that? And what I was left with, here's this man who I admired more than anyone. All I wanted to do was have the kind of career that he had. That's all I wanted. And the performances that I saw, the greatness that I saw in him, that is permanent. That will always live in me. And I was able to share that with other people. I even was able to share it with people who had never seen him, because I hopefully was channeling him. That's what I was attempting to do.
Do you forgive him in the show? Is there a redemption?
Yes, because he lived on in me, and I was able to share anecdotes that he had shared with me as I was bringing it to and I did all his parts after he was dead. And I did all the parts that I had so admired when he was alive.
Ed, what are you working on now?
I am preparing to do a completely rewritten version of my little musical, Whodunit the Musical, based on Mary Robert Reinhardt's The Circular Staircase, which was the first whodunit ever. And I wrote it, I don't know, 20 years ago, and it's had a lot of productions. But during the pandemic, I thought, I want to do a first-class version. It's been done in a lot of little theaters across the country. I want to do a first-class production. And I've been working on it for 2 years, and I'm about to go up to the Encore Theater in Michigan, run by Dan Cooney and Jessica Grove, both of whom I adore. And they're gonna let me put it up on its feet and see what I've accomplished in these last 2 years. And I've just started writing a really devastating, it's called Greenwich Village Follies. It's about when I moved in 1975, right next to Sheridan Square, and two of my closest friends moved within a block of Sheridan Square, and we all went down the rabbit hole of the craziness that was going on in Greenwich Village prior to the AIDS crisis. And then we entered the AIDS crisis, and one of my two best friends died horribly. And the other one lost his mind and then killed himself. And then I became a drug addict. And I think I have a perspective on it that no one else has. And it's a terrifying story. I've been very heartened by being able to tell the George Rose story, that it might be possible for me to tell a story that I wouldn't have thought it was possible to tell.
Is it with music?
No, this is,
No.
I'm attempting to write like an HBO miniseries. It's currently a treatment. I've got about 35 pages of just what I think is devastating material. And I just spoke with a very well-known director about an hour ago about how we might possibly proceed to get this to the right people. And it's so devastating to work on that I'll work on it for a day and then I have to put it away. I'm like, oh my God, I can't live in this world. But then I keep being drawn back to it. I just think I'm supposed to do it. And hilariously, Whodunit the musical is just lighter than air. It's lighter than No No Nanette. So,
Even lighter than that.
yes, it's pretty light.
Okay, that's a good place to end. Magda, do we have some questions from the house?
There is nothing in the chat room.
No questions?
Oh,
Have I told all the stories?
Well, hopefully everybody will read the book.
Here's
I could listen to you for another hour.
a little sad story. During the pandemic, my book publisher went belly up. So there are a lot of copies floating around. If you go on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, you can probably get a used copy, but there's one. But the company,
That's fine.
the company went bankrupt. So I've thought about rebooting it and getting it to another publisher, but at this moment, that's really not at the top of my list.
I think Joe wants to ask you a question also.
Okay.
Joe?
Yes, I'm wondering, my friend Mary Bond Davis was in Best Little Horse too, and was wondering, I adored working with her in Hairspray, and I wondered, she also told me about how badly Tom Walsh was treated by some of the producers, and that I wanted to get your reaction about
The sound is not very
Yeah,
clear.
we can't hear you.
Who was treated badly by whom?
She told me stories about how Tommy Walsh was the director, was really mistreated, and how Anne Margaret kind of came to his defense.
Well, that's a very long gone history. The show was not coming together in a particularly good way, and things weren't going well on a number of fronts. And they brought in Eric Schaefer, who happens to be one of my favorite people in the universe. So, and he's also directed me in Sunset and in Georgie. So it did not make me sad when Eric Schaefer came in, and I'm not familiar with Mary Bond's feelings on the subject because she didn't share it with me. What I'm assuming is that she had a previous relationship with Tommy and she didn't want to see Tommy go. I thought a number of changes were made that were very much for the better. I'm sorry that it was not nice for Tommy. Yeah.
We have something in the chat. Do you want to read the chat, Mark? Or should I?
Well, we have from Kevin saying, bravo, old friend, love the book, love this evening, love you, amazing as always. And
Which Kevin is this?
Kevin Lane.
Okay. Hey, Kevin Lane Derringer.
Yeah.
Hey, Kevin. Yeah.
And then Philip Hoffman says, I think you should do an audio book of your book.
I think that's a lovely idea. I actually had somebody offer me that. They have a studio in Florida. I would have to go down to Florida. I just don't think that may happen at this moment, but who knows? I didn't know I was going to end up going to the Kennedy Center either. So
It says, who else could tell the story like you? Philip said.
yeah.
That's true. Well, that's great. Anyone else would like to speak? Okay. Well, Well, it was a fabulous evening. I mean, oh, here, we have one more question here. Go ahead. Can you unmute yourself?
Was
Neil, it's Neil.
Can you hear me?
Now you can, okay.
Hi.
Hi, Ed.
Hi, Neil.
By any chance, do you have any memories of Alan Titus?
Yes, it's so funny. He was so young and so unspoiled and sort of quiet. And he had a kind of a sweet, small, you couldn't tell if he was a tenor or a baritone. He loved to sing with guitar. He sang with guitar in the show. He was always on it. He was always on his mark. He was always knew the music, knew everything, and was just really stalwart. And then, of course, he went to Europe and had a very large operatic career. And finally, he became an extremely dramatic baritone, and he ended up playing Wotan.
Hard to believe, isn't it?
Yes, this sweet,
Because
sweet
he was
boy
a
with a
light
guitar.
lyric baritone.
Yes, yes, yes.
Thank you. I'm glad,
Yes.
glad to hear that.
Yes.
Okay, anyone else? Well, on that note, I just want to thank you as always, great storyteller. And it was such a pleasure that I finally got to have you on the Zoom, and having you interviewed by Foster is a real treat.
Thank you so much, Magna, for making this happen. And thank you so much, Foster, for being so wonderfully prepared. What a pleasure this evening.
Exactly.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you.
And hope you'll come to the Lambs and have dinner or just, come whenever you're around.
If I ever leave my apartment, I'll go right to the Lambs.
There you go. You let us know. We'll host you. Wonderful.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
everybody.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Have a
Be
great
well.
night. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Ed. Thanks.
Thank you.